You're listening to episode 151 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ben Fleury-Steiner joins us to talk about mindfulness practice in Delaware at Open Heart Zen, and to continue our theme of compassion for others as he discusses his book, Dying Inside, the HIV/AIDS Ward at Limestone Prison. When we do metta practice, starting with ourselves, then our loved ones, families, friends, associates, and all the way to those with which we are at odds, it's very removed. We are typically in a safe and comforting environment and don't really have to grapple with the very tangible activities of dealing with people who are suffering. That's something we do off the cushion in our daily lives. But we might not actually be engaging with others who are suffering. For many of us, though our metta practice is sincere, innocent, and with the most heartfelt compassion, we might not actually deal directly with those who are in true torment. Only some of us have that face-to-face engagement with suffering of others, their pains, sorrows, and often tragic circumstances. Some of us do. Have either never had or have taken off the blinders of ignorance and very really and tangibly give back to those most in need. Professor Ben Fleury-Steiner earned his bachelor's degree in criminal justice and his master's and doctoral degrees in sociology from Northeastern University. His research interests include inequality, law and society, and social control. I'd also like to make a special thanks to Dwight for your review of this podcast on iTunes. I really appreciate your kind words. So, everyone, sit back, relax, and have a nice mint julep. And our guest today is Ben Fleury-Steiner. Ben, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ted.
We're here to talk about a number of things, one of which is your work on the prison system and some of the things that you run into there, and your book about this, Dying Inside. But before we get to that, let's start by finding out a little bit more about your background with meditation and your professional career.
Yeah, sure. It's a lot of rivers that sort of flow into one and then out again. But let's start, I think, probably with the gusher in my life. I know some folks, it's diseases, it's sort of ruptures that, turn them inward. And so for me, there was I didn't even know anything about Buddhism, but looking back, it was a huge transformation. That was, I was actually in the early 90s an enlisted military police officer in the Army. And I served in Operation Desert Storm from January 1990 to 2 months in there, about April of 1990. And my unit, we were in the, some folks may remember the Scud missiles. We were in Scud territory, patrolling the rear area. And it was a very routinized kind of job, but strange situation, sort of sitting in a combat theater like sitting ducks waiting for the Patriot missiles to take out the Scuds. And that was sort of what would happen a lot. And and then coming home and as a veteran, many veterans go through the experience, I think, generally just sort of feeling out of sorts. Um, but then for me, as a reservist, an Army reservist, jumping back into school, and then just sort of seeing school very differently. Before I had a very focused plan. I was going to be an FBI agent or something like that. And then, but then just hearing teachers in ways I hadn't heard before, being utterly fascinated by philosophy and sociology and whatnot, and but still also dealing with anxieties and those kinds of things that were uh, left over, I think, from my experience in Desert Storm, because I left right back into school in June. Uh, but then, in terms of the practice, it really came into my life in graduate school. I didn't leave school. I actually came back with a 2 point, something or other grade point average, and then, became a really serious student and discovered sociology and then went on for a PhD. And folks that have done that know it's extraordinary, stressful kind of situation where you're thinking about the dissertation all the time, and everybody's asking you whether you're going to be done. And, so that's when I was at Northeastern University in Boston. A friend of mine encouraged me to make my way over to Cambridge, and I went to the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center and got my first taste of the Vipassana practice. And it was horrible the first time I did it.
So many times I hear the first meditation experience is the hardest,
Yeah,
and yet you came back.
yeah, it was just so much pain physically, and I think I had every pillow in the place, propping me up. And, but Dariana Leipson Grady, was the teacher there, was just incredibly supportive and just kind of disarmed me in the interview, saying, don't worry about any of that, just be with it all, don't try to do anything. And so I came back the second day begrudgingly, and I sat and I had this a very simple experience, but extraordinary at the time, which was just observing all this pain physically and the mind, and then just sort of watching it all release. And so that was probably my first physical hook into the practice. And then fast forwarding, getting my first academic job after hundreds of rejections, because that's that path, which is sobering. To here in Little Delaware, a place I had never been to before, and and trying to find if there was any sanghas, and there was one I discovered in the Korean Zen tradition, in the Kwanam School of Zen, and showed up there, and the first experience was kind of a little bit, shall we say, intimidated. The teacher was in full robes, and not something that I sort of envisioned being involved in. I like the sort of practical aspect of being able to just sit and none of the trappings. And maybe that comes from my Jewish background, also sort of being bar mitzvah in the conservative Jewish tradition, and but not being sort of being disenchanted a bit, I think, with the traditional religious organizations. But it was kind of remarkable because my teacher at the time just said, one a thing that really struck me as wonderful about Zen, and that was just do it. It's simple. Just don't worry about anything. Just be here. And so I, I stayed, and then I had a retreat. And after that retreat, decided I wanted to take the precepts. And for me, it was something I needed, I think, because I was a new professor and I needed some organization. I knew how important the practice was for me in dealing with this massive life change. And so the precepts for me were like something I could come back to, and remind me of, it gave me inspiration, shall we say, to keep on just doing it, which we know is easier said than done. And then, yeah, I was ordained um, in the quantum tradition, became a Dharma teacher. And then, life changes, big life changes, with getting married and having kids, and then moving up here to Wilmington, and getting involved with a Unitarian church with my wife. And the minister, who's a Buddhist, asked me, "Do you want to start a meditation group during the coffee hour?" And I said, that could be pretty interesting. And I showed up that first day in full robes,
Just to intimidate others as you had been initially.
But I think by that time, like I was kind of less intimidated. I was sort of like, I loved the practice, and just they felt comfortable. And but yeah, it was immediately I could feel resistance to the formality of it all. And one thing I did that I do as a sociology professor, um, I teach classes on race. I also have a secondary appointment in Black American Studies, and I love to have my students feel like they're part of the class. So I just do very simple things like, particularly in the smaller classes, like have them introduce themselves and say, why are you here? What are you interested in? Or ask them, talk about a life experience maybe they've had with race, because I have some of my uh, Black American Studies students who share, some wonderful stories, always that are profound, particularly for the white students, I think, in the class. So anyway, I just said, let's go around the circle and sit, and talk about a little bit of how are you doing, and how's your practice going, what brings you here. And it was astounding, what came out of people's mouths. I mean, some people just said, "I'm curious," and blah blah blah. But others, said really profound things like, my mother died last week, and everything is turned upside down, or I'd just gotten through cancer, and I've been dabbling with this practice for a long time, and it's helping me. And I felt like at the end of that, it was wow, just this circle of sharing, was such a profound, I guess, together, they call it together action, but more of a mindful kind of sharing and just opening. Uh, and that's something that I've continued to do. And it's so, it's so simple, but it's such a radically equalizing practice. Instead of just jumping in with the sitting or the chanting or the Dharma talk, all that stuff, begin by hearing from everyone, and letting the sangha, as I've come to really believe, sing, and what comes out of their mouths a lot, is more profound than any sutra, because it's their lived experiences in their life, and it's safe. We really go out of our way too to make it safe for everybody. We say, don't give advice, just listen. And if you want to give someone a hug, try your best to wait to the end. Guilty of giving people hugs during the talk, because people share some pretty profound things. But I think so. I think that sangha practice has been really powerful. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that a clearer direction for my practice wasn't the formal training anymore. Wasn't the formal practice, which is one of very structured. Uh, Very, very structured. And I'll be honest with you, it was the easiest decision that probably I've ever made, to take my robes off, uh, and just be a part of the sangha, but as a facilitator and someone who's had experience, and also someone who's so blessed because their Dharma brother, my friend, who co-facilitates with me, who went through the quantum tradition with me. We took our precepts together, but is just an amazing person who does MBSR and just a whole bunch of different things, and still does Zen, but co-facilitates this sangha with me. Um,
Let's talk about that for a bit. Open Heart Zen in Delaware. And for folks listening, I'll give the website address to this at the end of the discussion. But you had mentioned in our emails that it has something of an eclectic background. because you've got MBSR trained folks and you've got Zen in there, and you had characterized it as a practice for anybody.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about that, and in particular, as you tie this into your professional career as being part of the Black Studies Department at University of Delaware. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable because my experience in practicing, it was a very intimate thing, but I felt like I was a part of this sort of tradition, and I was just excited about Zen all the way. But as I've opened myself, what I've realized is the synergy. There's much more synergy between what I do as a white male who focuses on the sociology of race relations and the history of racial oppression. It's a big part of what I do and write about. Um, but that inclusivity, which is difficult, I would say, in not only in the classroom trying to get more diversity, um, but having my secondary appointment has been wonderful because I've been able to engage not only with black faculty but with African American students and have more diversity. Um, but yeah, surprise, surprise. Hello, this whole practice, it's so simple. That's what that's the essence. Anybody can do it. Just coming back, that simple coming back to the moment, and then that profound wisdom, of that simplicity. Um, is not special. It's just being with the breath, opening all the senses, opening everything, and just letting it all wash over us, and we can, as we all know, it's just being able to do that is so rich and so if you want to put a buzzword on it, radical inclusivity becomes very simple as a part of sangha. Um, and so yeah, the folks come. We've got a real nice sangha now. We probably have 15 or so regulars, and anywhere between 20 and 25 people show up, and from lots of different backgrounds in Buddhism, Tibetan, Korean Zen, Soto, Vipassana, Unitarians who are what do they call them? Godfreys,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Unitarians, but who like meditation.
Well, I imagine your experience with the Unitarian Church has helped support that, and I like that term, radical inclusivity. Um, do you ever run into some challenges having the different traditions represented, or is the focus really on the experience, and that seems to be a common thread upon which we all agree? How does that play out at Open Heart Zen?
Yeah, no, that's definitely been I think the glue that holds it together. There have been folks that came in the beginning, and it's it is a little sad because they really wanted to train in the Korean tradition, and so that's how I started. But then when I took off the robes, I haven't seen them since, and so um, you know I, there's always that intention to want to bring everybody in, but then there are people that um, this isn't the right situation for them. I can understand that. I
Yeah,
needed a
yeah.
very structured, austere situation in my life, and I wouldn't be here doing this practice if it wasn't for um, the Korean Zen tradition. So yeah, there are folks that want, that share through the email mostly, things that are more formal that they think we should do, and my response has been, um, let's really keep this open and share whatever it is you want to share in the circle. And if you want to give Dharma talks, and some folks have given talks and things like that about their different tradition, it's become this real embrace. I think folks talk about Buddhism. I remember my teacher said there's all these different kinds of traditions, but in many ways it's analogous to, in Japan, they eat with chopsticks. In Korea, they eat with the chopsticks and a spoon. In the U.S., they eat with a fork and knife, but the food all goes to the same place. so I'm just trying to create, as I tell folks that kind of want to just eat one particular food, I say I really want to embrace the smorgasbord. I really want people to be able to just feel, you know, open and free and yeah, and so we do a guided sitting and we teach through the MBSR because we found that to be just such a wonderful way to do it. And I remember looking back my own experience, given so here's a bunch of instructions and now go do it. But we've just found it to be amazing to learn how to do this simple practice by doing it. But we also have a guided sitting, and then we have a silent sitting, and some folks don't like the guided sitting. The most have stayed and now maybe like it a little more or whatever, but some have left because they want the silence, and that's fine too. But it's been my experience that the guided is very helpful for people, for a lot of people who come, because their lives are so busy and there's so much chaos going on, and to kind of begin our practice by just setting the ground with some easy um, uh, either phrases about attending to the body, attending to the sounds, or, I also have re-embraced the metta practice through, which I was first introduced, with Vipassana, and it's something I've been doing more and more, especially as a dad, and having kids. Having kids is the most intense retreat I have ever been on in my life. So I've been doing a lot of metta.
We just started doing Practice Circle recently, which is an online offering for folks where we use Adobe Connect, and we have a dozen or more people who show up for this every other week. And this most recent one was a metta practice. And our friend Mark Nickelbein, I did a guided meditation with that and wrote a whole article about metta. And I shared at the end of that having been doing metta for about 9 years myself, it is one of the hardest kinds of practice that you can do, but is also one of the most personally transformative. It's not about sending wishful thinking out into the ether and magic is going to happen. It's about changing our minds and our hearts and our intention and practicing that to get better at it. So I'm glad to hear you doing that. But yeah, it can be very challenging to do.
Absolutely. It is challenging, but it's, as you said, I mean, uh, we need to train in being compassionate because we're so caught up in all the things in our lives. And so metta brings us back to, being with those difficult individuals, those difficult situations. And for me, I find like Zen flows very nicely with metta because it's just, the being with the breathing and then letting the phrases just sort of emerge on their own. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, I'd be kidding if I would say that I've had some difficult times with my two 5-year-old twins and I'm doing metta and I'm just watching my mind, sort of racing, to the solutions that aren't there. but, just, sending out blessings to the kids. It's so simple, but so powerful.
Let's take that as a nice segue. You had mentioned compassion, and I want us to get into a conversation about one of the books that you've written. And you have written several, and just so folks know, I'll be linking to about 4 of them on the webpage. But I wanted to chat about, for a bit, your book, Dying Inside, the HIV/AIDS Ward at Limestone Prison, and
Yeah.
how you're applying a couple of different of those threads, the different streams in your life on your background in criminal justice and sociology and your karuna, your compassion practice with this. Tell us about the book and what led you to write it.
So, um, I knew, in doing work early on in prisons, I'm a child of the 80s, but then as I emerged from my scholarship in the 90s, that there was a tremendous blowback against prisoners that most people don't know about in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has a gulag. It's human warehousing where people are locked in prisons with in unbelievably difficult situations. So one of the ironies, though, of this sort of human warehousing is it corresponded with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and so lots of IV drug users and folks who may never have had health care before um, are in the prison system. And I knew about the Southern Center for Human Rights and the amazing work they had done because a previous book I'd written was about the death penalty and had done a lot of death penalty stuff. But I never knew that there were places like Limestone. And Limestone Prison, to their credit, there's been a whole regime change and they're trying to make things better. But when I encountered it, which was just as this litigation was getting going, and that's what the book is about. It's the story of the struggle to save these prisoners' lives because 41 of them died. And to call it a prison is kind. It was an AIDS colony. It was an old warehouse, decrepit warehouse where it was common knowledge among the prisoners. And by the way, in Alabama, all prisoners go there with HIV, regardless of their offense. They're tested. If you've written bad checks, you wind up at Limestone. If you're a male, if you're a woman, you go to Tutwiler. And so they're all piled into this old warehouse, quarantined from the general population. And between 1998 and 2001, 41 of these prisoners died. And in learning about that case, as I gotten more and more into it, I just became obsessed with how this inhumanity could take place. How could it happen that in the late 90s, early 21st century, where folks are living long lives who have the HIV virus, are dying from AIDS wasting? How is it prisoners, 40 pounds at his death, was just left in this segregated AIDS ward? And through the study, which documents the experiences of these men and the struggle to save their lives, and also um, the remarkable story of the human spirit. They're helping each other. They're trying to educate each other. They're doing there's no hospice for them, so they're up there reading the Bible to each other, trying to, in the last days, many of them were featured in the book, including some that survived Limestone in the end. It was just breathtaking to me that despite it all, they could have the will to help each other survive. But as a sociologist, and I should also say that, overwhelmingly these folks were poor people and they're African American folks, because those are the folks that have been ensnared the most in this, what I think is absolutely accurately called the new Jim Crow, which has been the drug wars, hyper focus on impoverished communities of color, where folks are put in prison for long periods of time, and over these decades, huge numbers of African American folks behind bars. But for me, as a sociologist, seeing the obvious um, de facto racial oppression, that it was disproportionately black folk and poor folk who were experiencing this needless suffering. Um, what was interesting to me was there was no bad apple. I mean, the bad apple story is, I think, a story that we're kind of obsessed with in our culture. And I think, it's a challenge in Buddhism, because so much of what we're doing is about the individual. It's a very individual practice, but then you come to share with each other. But you're doing this internal work so much that you don't see the forest. And so you hear things maybe that are bad, and you sit with them. But to see that what was happening at Limestone was an institution overwhelmed, and with not the intention to make these people suffer, but because of these laws of mass imprisonment, And because of the lack of funds to give folks the kind of treatment they need, which wasn't particularly expensive, but just the utter failure to give them the care they needed. The realization, and it's interesting because I'm a big fan of J. Krishnamurti, and he was amazing. He's kind of an iconoclast figure in our whole practice here, but he was so critical of institutions. I now I understand where his criticisms, although maybe from a different place, but really came to life for me in seeing how it was so much about cost savings. It was so much about, um, you know, denial of responsibility, and then the powder keg explodes, and people are dying, and before, and 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 so yeah, the seeing how these institutions hide away people, disappear people, and literally let them die. And it's happening in our prisons all over the country. It's also happening in emergency rooms all around the country and other institutions that deal with marginalized populations. But for me, knowing about this um, is so important because it wakes us up to the fact that what we call suffering, which in our practice sort of begins with the unsatisfactoriness of the individual. It's of course suffering of the victims of Hurricane Sandy and these awful disasters, and then all over the world what's going on. But suffering right within our midst are tax dollars going to these prisons, places of pain, torture, death. And for many folks, because of their disease, it's a second punishment. And so dying inside, not surprisingly, ends with a real scathing critique of this mass imprisonment project that we're still undertaking in the U.S. And also the real need to uh, learn more about the particulars. And the book documents the particulars and all their gory detail. But I would be betraying the audience if I didn't, talk about AIDS wasting and the way these people died, because this is what's happened, and this is what we confront as a society, and this is what we are going to have to change.
Yeah, and that's a perfect lead into the next question that I wanted to ask you is based on your experience here and what you've seen and how compassion is being set aside when it comes to dealing with people who are in either through difficult socioeconomic means, they are constrained and funneled into prison, or through our own attitudes about illness. How can change happen? What are some of the paths to making that change a reality? And I know it's an enormously complex issue. There isn't a magic bullet, but what are some of the things that can start making that change?
I think it definitely begins with the radical awareness, and that's why I do what I do, in terms of telling these stories, because it's history that, you know, will die with these men unless someone tells the history. But I mean, yeah, it's enormously challenging because of the capitalist-driven media that focuses so much on infotainment. And so stories like this really, if they get any attention at all, it's a tragedy story, and there's no sort of detail. Or more likely, when you talk about prisoners, when you talk about the poor who are ghettoized in places that are a natural outgrowth of generations of systematic neglect on part of the society, and folks just any city you go to, why do people live in those bad places? They choose to live there. No, they don't.
Right,
They're,
right.
they're there because of historical circumstance and the lack of privilege that allows them to be socially mobile. So the question though becomes, how do you change consciousness? And this is, extraordinarily difficult. One thing I will say that I see a lot, and it's an interesting phrase um, that was coined by a sociologist. It's called the principle of less eligibility. And so what that means is that we when we talk about crime, we talk about poverty, we talk about prisoners, there's this very simplistic comparison. Well, they're criminals, they're the poor, uh, they're prisoners, they're criminals, whatever. And then they're law-abiding people. Why should they be eligible for health care? Why should they be eligible for humane treatment when folks aren't getting it? So it's this vicious cycle of denial through the principle of less eligibility that I think is fostered by the media, by politicians who are very opportunistic, looking to be tough on crime, et cetera. By our whole system, and
It's engrossed denial of, say, community-based policing, which is much more effective at reducing crime rates than, say, increased ownership of guns. And this is, as a gun owner speaking, I look at the evidence. The evidence suggests that that's not the solution. It's enhanced compassion. It's enhanced relationships.
right. And I think that example too also is with the institutions. Most police officers in this day and age aren't racist. This is their job. They're given an institutional imperative. Go make numbers, make arrests, win the war on drugs. If you don't do that, you're not going to last very long as a cop. So that it's and as same with prosecutors, and in many places, there's tremendous pressure. But the problem is the policies. So much of the blame goes with the policymakers who are caught up in the power posturing, which uh, creates these situations where I think the institutional actors are driven. I've heard it from police officers, even wardens I've talked to, who've said they hate mass imprisonment. It's insane. It's so overcrowded. Um, there's so many folks that shouldn't be in here. There are low-level drug dealers. There's so many folks that are elderly. There's so many folks with serious diseases, and they shouldn't be here. I've heard the same from police officers. We need to be doing real police work, like solving, cold cases or providing, help to people in the community rather than, targeting folks. So this institution almost takes on these institutions of oppression take on a whole life of their own. And so this has been going on for so long. How do we get ourselves out of it? I guess I take hope in the community, that there are people that are brave enough to speak out and to try to do something different. Um, and I think maybe that's happening with the drug war, that the folks around the country are beginning to really question it. Uh, and But I think it's so difficult with our politics because it's the opposite of what we're trying to do in our practice, which is to put down opposites and to see things for the way they are. We're in this political world of creating opposites, of doing everything possible to polarize.
Yeah, we have a conflictive process, not a collaborative one. And yet I do see certain sparks of hope in what you're doing with books to raise the awareness of these kinds of situations. Our friend Gary Watts had started the Buddhist Police Support Network. So we see even in law enforcement, there's an interest in this. In Mike Nam's work in creating a Facebook page for U.S. military Buddhists, where you can be in the military and still be practicing this wonderful idea of compassion. And how does that work? And I know he's gotten some pushback from it, and that's the episode right around this one as well. So we are seeing some awareness coming. We are seeing some practice. We are seeing people going into prisons and teaching meditation. Um, what are some of the things that you are running into that you are seeing as hopeful elements in fostering this change? What are some things you're seeing?
Yeah, there's some amazing organizations out there where there are people, doctors going into prisons providing, healthcare, without any money at all, just helping folks. There's an amazing organization in the Bay Area, and by the way, in Dying Inside, I talk about these organizations, and there's an appendix, a very detailed appendix of the organizations that are actually doing activist kind of work, advocacy kind of work on behalf of prisoners. But one is Justice Now, and it's run in San Francisco, and not only do they work on compassionate release issues, but when the prisoners that get out, um, they put them immediately on the board of their organization, so it's seamless. It's not that we're helping you and you're a prisoner. It's no, this is a partnership from the beginning. Um, and so the work they do, it's remarkably empowering. It's community and advocacy all together. And then of course, yeah, I mean, the folks you've interviewed and these different hospice projects that are where they're using Buddhist practice to come in and to just be with folks um, in their last days. That support them by just being there with them. But there is a lot of pushback too. Absolutely. Um, there's a wonderful documentary called Dhamma Brothers, which some folks may have heard of, and you can see what happens. Because um, ultimately prisons are places of total conformity, of being stripped down, being controlled, being deprived liberty. And our practice is one of freedom. And so when a prisoner isn't broken down, when a prisoner smiles and is light and is benefiting from the practice directly in their lives to be with the suffering in the prison that they're experiencing, but to be able to just be with it, that's seen by many prison regimes as a threat. And that's really sad, because it could help, and as that documentary shows, it can radically help prisoners, I think, in particular.
It will, and in fact, I'm glad you brought up Dhamma Brothers because I'm currently emailing back and forth with Jenny Phillips, who is the producer of that documentary, to get her on the podcast to share that as well. So thank you for bringing that up, and folks listening, that's coming. I'm working on it. It's on the way. She's already agreed. We just need to make sure we get it scheduled and on the list. Ben, I wanted us to take a step now into some more recent work that you've been doing. I know that since publishing Dying Inside, I think you have a more recent book, your latest book, Disposable Heroes, The Betrayal of African American Veterans. Could you talk for a couple minutes about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a book I never thought I would write being a veteran. When I got out of the military, I wanted to be as far away from the military as possible and to move on with my life. But it just circumstances came about 4 or 5 years ago that I learned of a transitional housing program in Wilmington, in one of the more impoverished neighborhoods in the city of Wilmington, Delaware, which is a tremendously segregated city by race and class. I mean, just real savage inequalities, and it's small and it's in your face. And I went there, and I knew there were vets there. I didn't realize how many, and that was something that also always kind of appalled me, to say the least. That folks who've made the ultimate sacrifice for their country could wind up with nothing, could be just abandoned on the street, and so as I sat down and talked to them about their life histories, all of these stereotypes of the broken veteran and PTSD, they're traumatized, and there's sort of these zombies just sort of floating around. Or you'll hear about the horror story, in the media, the veteran who's home and snaps and kills a bunch of people, or the veterans, it's a tragedy story. But when you talk to them, as I did with 30 vets, and that's the focus of the book, of the life histories of African American vets from the Vietnam era to the current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was just incredible stories of for the Vietnam guys. Many of them were drafted, and they were drafted at a time right after Dr. King was assassinated, and there were race riots in Wilmington. And so to go from a place where your neighborhood is being occupied, and literally, actually, the National Guard was called in to many cities, including Wilmington, and so these guys were going off to war to fight for their country while their own city was occupied by the very military that they were fighting for. And so it was just astounding to learn about that and to learn about those experiences. But then when they came back, um, to hear about the paranoia. I know the VA is in the book. It's really not about the VA, because all the guys I end up talking to have gotten help from the VA. And what I discovered was that it's much more reactive. It's like when something really serious goes down, they go to the VA. It's not VA is not a proactive organization by any stretch. But these folks coming back from Vietnam, I mean, it was just so difficult. One of the guys I interview in the book, he was given the job um, actually by the VA because he was very intelligent and persistent in getting his benefits, and it took many years. But his job was to go into the poorest neighborhoods in Wilmington to convince poor African American veterans to come to the VA so they could get benefits. And he told me, out of hundreds of folks, maybe a dozen responded because they were so mistrustful of the system. But again, it's appalling because they're deserving of benefits that they will never get and never have gotten to this day. And so that's one of the revelations I think in the book, is that we have these folks we call heroes, our wounded warriors, and we hang the yellow ribbons and we go to the parades and we celebrate them, which I'm glad we do. But the fact of the matter is, so many of them return to communities where they don't have the social supports, and that includes folks that live in the most racially marginalized, impoverished communities. Most people think of ghettos as places where there's drug dealers and criminals. The answer to that is, or the response to that is, clearly you are wrong. There are war heroes that live in those communities. There are veterans. There are people that are struggling on behalf of their communities for many years, who are forgotten and left there. And so that's another revelation, I think, more broadly for me as a Black American Studies scholar in particular, is, one of the real travesties of racial inequality in America, and you talk about a lack of compassion and denial of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, and what has creates these ghettos, is that veterans who were from those places go to combat. Many come back with lots of problems to those same neighborhoods, but they're also riddled with those same problems of racial inequality, like joblessness, like illness, um, things that those of us in the privileged classes would think would be, and just assume are positive, like when mom dies, we inherit the house, so we have wealth and we can move on. But if you're a vet who's impoverished, who's dealing with a lot of those situations, but also back in the ghetto, and you inherit an old tenement house, and all of a sudden you realize you can't afford the taxes and you can't get stable tenants, and then before you know it, you're bankrupt and you're homeless. It's counterintuitive. but that's what happens because we have these places in the society that are the homes to vets, to mothers, to sisters, to brothers, to all manner of kinds of folks, and yet there's no support for them, and so they really become disposable. I don't particularly like the title. The press, I threw it out there once, and the press said, "Yeah, we're going to go with that." But I don't see these guys as disposable at all because I think one of the other stories too about the book that was amazing to me was despite all of the continued suffering that they go through, they don't make excuses at all. Despite again another popular media fiction that the poor just complain and the dependent and they just want a handout. These guys, were the opposite of that. They would constantly say, it's just after telling me something really, really horrible, like, after coming home and, one of their buddies they served a nom with, blew his brains out, uh, and still dealing with that loss on top of everything else. They would say things like this. Well, but it's just it's another day, and you got to keep driving on. You got to keep moving on. And that's all I want in my life is just another day. And I'm hoping things will be better. And I'm proud of my service, and I love my family, and it's just amazing. Again, the human condition revealed in these experiences of tremendous suffering and tremendous inequality, and yet the willingness um, to not make excuses, to help your fellow prisoner with AIDS who's dying, to help your grandson, um, who's now in poverty, and you're a Vietnam vet who's got all sorts of health problems and other problems, but saying to me with an incredible smile and a sense of pride about being with his grandson and how it was like just such a gift and how thankful he was for that. It's just remarkable, uh, you know, to me. And so again, I see my job as these are the histories and the stories of quote unquote veterans and quote unquote prisoners that need to be told in all their detail, and we see both the the oppressive and horrors of it, but we also see the remarkable drive to not be to not have one's humanity taken away and to try to make the best of one's life, despite it all.
I'm glad that there are efforts ongoing to not just raise awareness, but to help. And I hold in my hand a DVD, Healing a Soldier's Heart, Loving Kindness Meditation for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder,
Mm-hmm.
which is another documentary about how we're helping our heroes who have come back home deal with the horrible things that they've had to go through. So I appreciate your raising that awareness. I wanted to ask what you're working on now. Is there another book that you're considering working on?
Yeah, I mean, the experience with dying inside and being with the prisoners, um, who made it out alive, and my co-author Carla Crowder, from who's an investigative reporter or a former investigative reporter down there in Birmingham who had been covering this story for much longer than I even knew about it. Um, but learning from them their experiences surviving, but being with folks who are dying. Um, for me, I really am drawn back to the prison, um, and particularly hoping to be able to get access to um, prisoners that are in palliative situations, hospice situations, and from the inside, trying to really learn about um, their experiences, and some of them obviously I won't be able to talk with, but maybe I can connect with family members, and those that I can talk with, I really want to talk with them as well, because they're dying right now as we speak, and no one knows about them. They're just lost behind prison bars. But as you said, there are these amazing folks out there who are going in to try to help them. So that I hope that will be a part of the story too, that I can maybe get entree um, into those situations, prison hospice. And I know there's a documentary being made about this called Prison Terminal. And I don't know I forget who the documentary filmmaker is, but I had learned about that. And so it's going on, and so I'm hoping to go back. And one of the other things I think where maybe with the veterans thing crosses over is there's such a disproportionate number of veterans who are incarcerated, and many of the vets, if not most, I interviewed had been also ensnared in the prison system, and so and particularly the older folk that I talked to, there's a lot disproportionate number of Vietnam guys who are locked up, and so that may also be a part of this as well, as in going into these spaces of the last days of prisoners, that some of them might also be veterans, and I know there are getting access is another story, but I think that's also another part of the chapter, another part of the history and chapter of the veteran story too, that it needs to be told, that our vets are not only forgotten about in their communities, but they're vets that are in prison who are forgotten about and left to die alone. But yeah, that experience uh, generally is really where I'm drawn to, and um, being there too. And I think also there's a part of me that's realizing maybe that, um, and there's some scholars in my field uh, who just do something called participatory action research, where they actually will become trained in a particular area and work, with with whatever population they're studying as much more equal, not just the sort of researcher who's there.
Yeah. No.
And so I've really been feeling like this could be a place for my practice as well, that I feel very drawn to. And maybe that's also from the Open Heart Sangha, hearing from folks that have just lost people, and feeling the real need to be with people who are dying. And so there's a lot of that going on in prison. And so if I can get access, if I can train as a volunteer, and also have it as part of my research, where it all kind of comes together, would be in many ways right now for me the ultimate study, that I assume would be many years of being immersed, um, in that experience. So
Yeah, our friend Chuck Prebish has mentioned that this idea that researchers have to maintain a distance and not be practitioners isn't always going to work in contexts like exactly what you're describing, where you are a practitioner, you are a scholar. There's no denying the confluences of those practices that lead to the positive work that you can do in following what's happening, because there aren't a lot of people who have that particular set of traits that leads them into that. So I think it's a very good and positive thing for you to continue on that same path.
yeah, and one thing I'll say too, the vets, like, there so many of them are such horrible health, and um, this particular locale that I studied in the transitional program, I would alert the director, because a lot of them just didn't want to be a bother. So I felt like I mean, it's my ethical obligation. If someone is suffering with a condition, I could tell them. And I also did give veterans rides to the VA, and I also even the last chapter of the book talks about an experience I had with a Vietnam vet who was facing prison time for another drug relapse situation, and I wrote a letter on his behalf, and I accompanied him to court, and it was one of the more terrifying experiences of my life because I thought he was for sure going to be. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew that the judge had to hear this Purple Heart winner, infantry, combat Vietnam vet story, the whole story, not just the criminal story. And
Right,
so,
right.
thankfully, when he came back, the judge from Chambers, after quite a long time, in this diversionary setting where he has the power literally to remand people back to prison, he he said, I thank you for your service. And I was like, oh, what is he going to say next? He said to Carl, the veteran, I'm gonna let you go in. I'm gonna let you continue on with your treatment, but with the caveat: if I see you here again, I'm sending you back up the river.
But
So
giving the opportunity for change.
yeah, yeah, being there, not just to record stories and publish books that go to my merit review, but to publish books and be in places where I can help, even in a little bit. But that's really, as you said, I really feel so strongly that whatever I do next, I want it to be more than just that. I want to really combine the helping with the research and the documenting of the stories and having the stories be told, but also really combining the two.
It's a very complex story. It's not black and white. There is quite a great deal of diverse conditions that have these results. And to try to sum it up into a simple magic bullet, black and white answer is not the case. Things are more complex than that. And let's take that actually as segue to happier topics that you also have a bit of a diverse background on your own. Is that you're also a producer of ambient music,
Yes.
which is completely in a different area, and yet it's a part of your life. So tell us for just a few minutes about that as well.
I had the privilege in graduate school of living with two classical music composers in the 90s who were one of them in particular was very into minimal music, and I had no idea about minimalist music, and so I was listening to Philip Glass and Steve Reich and these wonderful minimalist composers, but then he also had some Brian Eno, and I've never listened to sound besides the human voice, where someone's offering a story that just lights your whole insides up in a way that is like again, a wake up. And this music that could do that was spellbinding to me. And later I learned that Eno in Music for Airports actually wrote that, composed that for himself while he was sick because it made him feel good. And so I became obsessed with the listening, and I was kind of a fiddler on guitars, and I was interested in synthesizers and the sounds and things like that, but I never had the time to be able to follow that interest in creating sound, and I think it's absolutely connected to the meditation practice because I find sound to be such an overwhelmingly amazing part of our practice. Being in the sound field as things are just happening and evolving. Um, and so I think that direct meditative aspect was also something that really drew me into ambient music, which is about creating these moods. And so when I got to Delaware, I had a real job and I had some money. I bought um, a little synth, which became a real obsession with these tiny little mini modular synthesizers, and these really simple um, programs on computers that allow you to add, um, incredible textures and mixing without a lot of knowledge. And so I sort of threw myself into that, and I found like it was it was just a wonderful artistic, creative outlet that I hadn't discovered before. That I realized that this listening and creating sound sort of all came together, and it's who for anybody like yourself, who listens to ambient music, it's not like listening to any other kind of music.
Right, right.
It's really like a raga or something. It's a religious aspect to it, the drone. It just draws you so deeply into the moment, into the sound field. And so, yeah, I really, really got into it and just kept going and ended up becoming within a very, niche, small genre, fairly accomplished ambient musician. Having my most recent release was um, white 12-inch vinyl pressing by a label in the UK called Low Point Records, which is a wonderful little boutique ambient music label. And so that's been just a wonderful side part of it, that there are people that are really into the listening that never immersed themselves or had the desire to want to immerse themselves in the sound creation part of it, who are um, just will buy they buy everything. They're really into packaging. That's the other thing for me that I love. I listen to MP3s and iPods just like everybody else, but God, do I love the sound of vinyl, or, or the sound of a CD on a really good system, or to hold a beautiful tactile CD packaging with that photography and the artwork. Um, that whole experience is so wonderful, and it's sad that these shops, where you could in the past, drive to, or those of us that were into it could find, somehow, or there a lot of them aren't there. There's some that are there, which is good in Europe and a few in the U.S. But to me, it's like the whole art form of the packaging and the way it's released is beautiful, and it creates it allows for the sound, I think, in many ways to be preserved as this found object to celebrate, not as MP3 to delete.
Yeah, I think about our own experiences with albums from the 70s, and you can't hear a Yes tune without picturing the wonderful art that they used for that. And Ben, you had some very recent good news about modern abstract music. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your recent news?
I think, yeah, this is a new label that I'm launching. I started a label um, in 2003, 2004, after making some recordings and realizing there were other folks out there, and just it was a community situation, and so it was a way to just organize and get people's sounds out there that other people might not know about, but kind of put them all in one place. And I did that for a while, and it was much more quantity over quality, because CDRs are cheap. Um, but the more as I've gotten into it and then stepped away um, from the label thing for a few years, I've come to the realization that I want to get back into it, because I think there are so many amazing artists that in the past they were like heroes to me. in my head thought of them as, accomplished artists, but folks who do abstract music, particularly ambient music, they've got full-time jobs, or if they don't have full-time jobs, I mean, they are really busting it to try to survive. And so, I, I decided that I want to create an outlet that really focuses on quality, fewer releases, but done with beautiful packaging and not necessarily my own work. I'm not even sure if I will release I'm much more now, I think, been taken back into the listening of these hero artists of mine,
Mm-hmm.
and so seeing it as a way to to celebrate their work. It's the artistic engagement of listening and then working with graphic designers and those kinds of things, but with no deadlines, with no hyper focus on release.
Excellent. Well, we'll be linking to that website to make sure that people who are interested in finding out more about that will get a chance to look at the site for modernabstractmusic.com. And I also wanted to mention the other website for folks who are interested in finding out more, in particular if you're in the Delaware area, is www.openheartzen.org. Our guest today, Ben Fleury-Steiner. Ben, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Ted. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.